Hello and welcome to Better Together with Shinrai Sensei. Today we are going to go over science, and the specific science branch that we're going over today is biology, also known as the life sciences. And we are going to ask the question, what is life? So, most basic question you're going to have in biology, and the question that biology in and of itself revolves around is, what is life? Because there's a lot of things that, people have asked throughout history, are they alive? So, you've got fire. Is that alive? Is a virus alive? Things like that. What is alive? What defines being alive, right? Well, there are conditions that have to be met in order for something to fall under the definition of life. The first few are that it has to grow, that it has to reproduce, and that it has to consume matter in order to do either of those functions. So growing, reproducing, and consuming matter to do either of those two things. Well, all three of those, you'd ask, is fire alive? And the answer is no. Fire is not, in fact, alive. So, we'll exit out up here too. No, fire is not alive. There are more factors than just those that determine whether or not something is alive, you see. If it was just those factors, you could argue that fire is alive. But it's not just those factors. There are plenty of other factors that go into this that negate fire's capability to be marked as alive, right? So, the first one that really cancels out fire being alive is it made up of a cell or cells? It's important to say a cell or cells because obviously there are single cellular living things such as bacteria and such as just multiple other single cellular organisms that tend to live on their own. Bacteria are the main group that we associate with being single cellular organisms. There are more. I can't tell you off the top of my head what they're called, but there are more single cellular organisms than just bacteria that are, the basic one cell plan that we suspect most life forms most life forms evolved from a single cellular organism, right? So, is it made up of a cell or cells? Well, as soon as you bring that question into the equation, fire's canceled out, right? So, here we have growing, reproducing, consuming matter, and cells. Okay? So now fire's canceled out, and you have to ask yourself on the virus thing whether or not a virus is really alive. Because it does have a cell, and they do grow, and they do consume matter, but they don't really have to consume matter, I should say. They don't necessarily have to consume matter. And their way of reproduction can be argued that they aren't actually reproducing. They're more a vessel that introduces a reproductive code, right? So if you know anything about viruses and the way that they exist, but also the way that they reproduce, you'll know that a virus, when it seeks to reproduce, a virus is basically a cell with most of the organelles that are the functioning parts of the cell that really help it to survive. Most of those organelles don't exist in a virus. Now, there is a question of viruses, whether or not they are the precursors to single cells that have all the organelles to exist on their own. There's many people ask that question of which came first, single cellular organisms or the viruses. Because if the virus came first, then the virus could have been the precursor to what we see as single cellular organisms, and this could have been the beginning of the evolutionary chain. That the true beginning of the evolutionary chain is a virus. But there are also some that posit the idea that the single cellular organisms had to have come first because of the method of reproduction of the virus. It's a kind of question of, which came first, chicken or the egg, because no matter what answer you come up with on whichever came first, at the end of the day, the answer doesn't exist, because one had to beget the other, right? So viruses really mess with people on like which had to have come first, the virus or the main reason that they suggest that the virus had to have come first is because a virus is a simpler, if you classify it as an organism, it is technically a simpler organism to a bacteria, because it lacks many organelles that help with basic life functions, but it also contains DNA, which is the next thing. Contains DNA. So containing DNA, made up of a cell or cells, consuming matter, reproducing, and growing. All of these things are met by a virus, with the exception of growth isn't really necessarily 100% true with single cells. When they split, they don't grow very much, if at all, in order to fill out the mitosis. Generally is usually almost a perfect replicating process. So when you're done, the cells are almost their full size, if not exactly their full size. So the growing one is debatable for any cell, single cellular organisms, but consuming matter, reproducing cells, containing DNA, and the final one is require water. Require water, or H2O. Right? These are all the things that define something, whether or not it is what we could classify as alive. And once again, like I said, viruses are brought up on most of these because they fit almost all the criteria that we would define a life form having. We just don't know exactly what about them makes them not alive. So the question's, still out there. Is a virus a living organism, or is it a non-living entity that we just have around us at all times? And once that question is sufficiently answered, and that debate is sufficiently, answered, well, then we have to ask ourselves another question. Which came first, the bacteria or the virus? Because a virus injects its DNA into a cell of either a multicellular or single cellular organism, a virus will inject its DNA into the cell, and then that cell will pick that DNA up as it's performing its own mitosis. It will collect that DNA, and then the DNA will be used by that cell unwittingly to replicate the virus. And then the cell becomes an active replicating machine, a factory, if you will, for the virus to be replicated over and over and over again until it is sufficiently replaced, right? And because it is actually using, the split DNA strand, because that's another reason why the DNA, it's not really DNA, it's the split DNA strand that viruses have. Because as your body's going to perform mitosis, the DNA gets split in two, right? And when your body splits DNA in two, you have the little code reading things, if you will, of your DNA will read each code separately on each half of the DNA strand separately in order to reproduce each half of the DNA strand separately, or reproduce the other half that they need to in order to have a complete DNA strand. And then that way each side of the cell, when it performs mitosis, will have a complete DNA. And the virus has that other half of a DNA strand that it will inject in there. And as your cells recombining the two DNA strands into one, when it recreates the other half, it will unwittingly combine the virus's half of a DNA in with the half of a DNA from the other cell, and that is what causes viruses to mutate. Because every virus, when it starts to be reproduced by a new body, every virus is mutated and is now no longer the same exact virus. The majority of the DNA stays the same for the virus, but it is no longer the same exact virus when it is replicated inside of your body. And this is why vaccines aren't really that effective against viruses, because viruses tend to be, you can't really vaccinate as well against viruses as you can against like a bacterial infection, because the bacterial infection, the virus changes every single person, every single thing that it interacts with DNA wise, it changes. But with a bacteria, the DNA of that bacteria is always the same, because the bacteria is its own organism, right? And so right now, leaning more towards no for viruses. But yeah, it's just a really tough question that we, frankly, aren't equipped to answer right now. There's too many things about it that could go either way when it comes to defining whether or not a virus is alive. But for now, we'll look at the overall picture. It used to also be, by the way, no longer is, but it used to also be a requirement of life for life forms to have oxygen for cellular respiration. But we've actually looked back in the fossil record, and here in Michigan, I'm not exactly sure where in Michigan, but in Michigan they were doing a mining operation in the early 1900s, and they found this thin layer of pink soil. I say thin when it's relatively thin compared to like rocks around it, but as far as how thick this layer of ground was, it had to have been substantial, at least that thick, right? And it was just straight up pinkish red, like the surface of Mars. And pardon me, well, we found out that the reason for that was the great oxidation, which is when you started to see primitive forms of algae started to produce oxygen for the first time and wiped out the organisms that came before them that were anaerobic or didn't require oxygen to survive. So there used to be another requirement of having to breathe oxygen in order to produce energy. Cells today need oxygen through the process of cellular respiration. Water and oxygen and carbohydrates are necessary in the body to produce energy through cellular respiration. And now we know that some of the most primitive bacteria are anaerobic in nature. They don't actually require air, as we see it, with oxygen in it, to breathe. In fact, many of the organisms that we suspect started the whole life revolution on the planet Earth, probably oxygen was toxic to them. So now that is not a requirement of life. But the rest of these, for the most part, are a requirement of life. It has to grow, it has to reproduce, it has to consume matter in order to perform the functions that it has. It is a cell, is either a cell or is made up of cells, contains DNA, and requires water, H2O. So these are the basic definitions that life forms have to meet in order to be, well, life forms, in order to be considered alive. And I think that will conclude today's lesson, and I look forward to seeing you guys in the next Science with Shinrai Sensei. Please post your comments in the comment section below. Any questions that you might have, you can post them below, or you can hit my Twitter line up at Shinrai Sensei 15. Just post your question to me, and I will get back to you as soon as I can. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope that you learned something today.